It was one of those evenings when the world outside seemed to melt into a hazy blur of raindrops and muted streetlights. Inside the house, the air was thick with the comforting scent of chamomile tea. The kind of evening where you curl up with a blanket and a good book, letting the rhythmic patter of rain lull you into a sense of peace. Claire had been looking forward to this moment all day. Michelle, her younger sister, had left earlier for a late business meeting, and her nephew Nathan had headed out to see friends. The house, for once, was hers. No footsteps, no doors slamming, no TV blaring in the background, just silence. Blissful, uninterrupted silence. The warm steam of her bath filled the bathroom as she leaned back, letting the water soak away the weight of the week. Lavender oil swirled in the foam, its scent wrapping around her like a soft, invisible cocoon. She closed her eyes, exhaling deeply, feeling the world slip away. But then a sound broke through the stillness. Footsteps, hesitant and light, yet unmistakable, just outside the door. Claire froze, her mind racing. Michelle couldn't be home yet, could she? And Nathan? Well, he wasn't due back for hours. Michelle? Claire called out, her voice bouncing off the tiled walls. No answer. Her pulse quickened as the door creaked open a fraction. The shadow of a figure stood there, backlit by the dim hallway light. Claire. Oh God, I'm sorry. Nathan's voice cracked through the tension. He slammed the door shut as quickly as he'd opened it, the echo of his footsteps retreating down the hall. Claire sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure whether to feel angry, embarrassed, or just plain awkward. She reached for a towel, wrapping it tightly around herself before stepping out of the bath. She found Nathan sitting on the couch, his face buried in his hands. Sophie, her ever-watchful ginger cat, sat perched on the armrest beside him, her green eyes flickering between the two of them as if trying to gauge the situation. Nathan. Claire started, her voice softer than she intended. What just happened? I thought you were Michelle, he stammered, his cheeks flushing the deep red. I didn't mean to. It's okay. Claire interrupted, waving her hand dismissively, though her own cheeks burned. It was an honest mistake. An awkward silence hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Sophie stretched lazily as if to break the tension, her tail flicking against Nathan's arm. Let's just forget about it, all right? Claire offered, forcing a lightness into her tone. Nathan nodded quickly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Yeah, of course. The next morning the house felt different. Nathan was unusually quiet, keeping his eyes glued to his cereal bowl during breakfast. He muttered a quick good morning before retreating to his room. Sophie trailed after him, her steps deliberate, as if she were playing the role of silent investigator. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Nathan had always been an introspective kid, polite, reserved, and a little too serious for someone his age. But today there was a tension about him that wasn't there before. She caught him glancing at her from across the living room later that afternoon, his gaze darting away the moment their eyes met. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. Teenage hormones, she told herself. It was probably just that. By dinner, the silence between them was deafening. Claire decided to take the first step, setting 2 plates on the table and calling him over. Nathan, join me for dinner. I made lasagna. He appeared in the doorway moments later, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. You didn't have to cook for me, he mumbled, taking a seat. Well, someone has to feed you, Claire quipped, trying to inject some humor into the moment. Unless you've suddenly become a master chef overnight. He cracked a small smile, but it faded just as quickly as it appeared. They ate in relative silence, the clinking of forks against plates filling the void. Thanks for dinner, Nathan said finally, breaking the stillness. It was really good. Claire looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. You're welcome. It's nice to have someone to cook for once in a while. Nathan hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. I mean it, Claire. Thanks for everything. You've been more understanding than most people. The words hung in the air, warm and genuine, yet tinged with something deeper. Claire felt a strange mix of pride and unease. Your family, Nathan, that's what we do for each other. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Claire heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Nathan standing there, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Can we talk? He asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I've been feeling off lately, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Like I don't know where I belong or what I'm supposed to do. Claire sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Nathan, it's okay to feel that way. Growing up isn't easy. I don't know what I'd do without you here, he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You make everything feel less lonely. Her heart ached at his words, a mix of maternal instinct and something else she couldn't quite name. You're not alone, Nathan, she said firmly. I'm here for you always. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, the space between them felt charged, electric. Claire quickly looked away, clearing her throat. You should get some rest. Things always seem clearer in the morning. Nathan nodded, standing up but hesitating at the door. Good night, Claire. Good night, Nathan. As the door clicked shut, Claire exhaled deeply, her mind swirling with thoughts she didn't dare entertain. Sophie hopped onto the bed, curling up beside her with a knowing look. What are we getting ourselves into, Soph? Claire murmured, stroking the cat's fur. Sophie purred in response as if to say, we'll figure it out. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow on the quiet living room. Claire sat on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a book, while Sophie stretched out lazily beside her. But Claire wasn't reading. Her mind kept drifting to the previous night, to the vulnerability in Nathan's eyes, the way his voice had trembled as he spoke. She sighed, closing the book with a soft thud. It wasn't like her to feel so unsettled, so unsure. She prided herself on being the calm, steady presence in everyone's lives. Especially Nathan's. He'd been through so much already with his parents' messy divorce, and she had vowed to be his safe haven. The creak of the stairs pulled her from her thoughts. Nathan appeared at the bottom, his hair tousled and a shy smile tugging at his lips. Morning, he said, his voice still thick with sleep. Good morning, Claire replied, forcing a smile. Did you sleep okay? Yeah, better than I have in a while. Actually, he admitted, scratching the back of his neck. He hesitated before sitting down across from her, his gaze flickering between her and Sophie. About last night. You don't have to explain, Claire interrupted gently. Sometimes we all just need someone to talk to. He nodded, though he still looked uneasy. Thanks for listening. I don't really have anyone else I can be that open with. His words hit her harder than she expected, a pang of sadness and protectiveness washing over her. Nathan, you'll always have me, she said softly. No matter what. Later that afternoon, Claire decided to break the growing tension with a little activity. She found Nathan in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone. How about we cook dinner together tonight? She suggested brightly. He looked up, surprised. Cook? Together? Why not? It'll be fun, she said, grabbing an apron and tossing one to him. You can be my sous chef. Nathan chuckled, catching the apron midair. All right, but don't blame me if I ruin everything. They spent the next hour chopping vegetables, debating the proper way to dice an onion, and laughing over Nathan's clumsy attempts at peeling garlic. The kitchen filled with the warm, savory aroma of simmering tomato sauce as Claire stirred the pot, glancing over at Nathan, who was carefully arranging slices of mozzarella on a baking tray. Not bad for a rookie, she teased, nudging him lightly with her elbow. He grinned, his confidence growing. You're not so bad yourself, Chef Claire. As they sat down to eat, the atmosphere between them felt lighter, easier. They talked about everything and nothing. Nathan's favorite movies, Claire's childhood memories, even Sophie's peculiar habit of stealing socks. I'm serious, Claire said, laughing. She has a stash of them under the couch. I caught her once with one in her mouth, looking guilty as sin. Nathan shook his head, laughing so hard he had to set his fork down. Sophie, you little thief, he said, reaching down to scratch behind the cat's ears. Sophie purred in response, her green eyes narrowing with satisfaction. As the evening wore on, their laughter gave way to quieter moments of conversation. Nathan opened up about his struggles at school, how he felt out of place, how hard it was to make friends. Claire listened intently, offering words of encouragement where she could. You're an amazing person, Nathan, she said earnestly. Anyone who doesn't see that isn't worth your time. He looked at her then, his expression softening. You always know exactly what to say. Claire's breath caught in her throat for a moment, but she quickly brushed it off, reaching for her glass of water. It's a gift, she said lightly. That night, as Claire curled up in bed, she couldn't help but replay the day in her mind. There was a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years, a quiet, unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. But there was also a flicker of unease, a nagging voice in the back of her mind reminding her to tread carefully. She had to maintain boundaries for both their sakes. Sophie leaped onto the bed, curling up beside her as if sensing her inner turmoil. Claire stroked the cat's fur absently, her thoughts swirling. What do you think, Soph? She murmured. Am I overthinking this? Sophie blinked up at her, her green eyes calm and steady as if to say, follow your heart but don't lose your head. The following day the house was quiet again. Nathan was in his room, and Claire busied herself with chores, trying to focus on the mundane tasks that normally grounded her. But as she folded the laundry, a sense of unease crept in. The events of the past few days lingered in her mind, and though she had tried to rationalize them, the tension between her and Nathan was undeniable. She sighed and made a decision. A walk will do us good, she thought. Fresh air and open spaces might clear their minds. She headed to Nathan's room and knocked gently on the door. Hey Nathan, she called. Feel like getting out for a bit? There's a nice trail by the river. It's perfect this time of year. There was a pause before the door creaked open. Nathan appeared, his eyes a little brighter than they'd been in days. Sure, he said with a small smile. Sounds good. The riverbank was alive with the sounds of nature. The gentle rush of water, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional chirp of a bird hidden in the branches. Claire and Nathan walked side by side, their steps crunching softly on the gravel path. This is nice, Nathan said after a while, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. It is, Claire agreed, glancing at him. I used to come here a lot when I needed to think something about the water. It's calming, you know. Nathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the river. I get that. It's like everything else fades away for a while. Claire smiled. Exactly. For a moment they walked in silence again, their steps in sync. Then Nathan spoke, his voice quieter this time. Can I ask you something? Of course, Claire replied, looking at him with curiosity. Do you ever feel stuck, like you're supposed to have it all figured out but you don't? The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, seeing not just her nephew, but a young man carrying burdens far beyond his years. All the time, she admitted. I think everyone does, even if they don't talk about it. Life's messy, Nathan. Nobody has all the answers. He seemed to consider this, his brow furrowing slightly. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with school, with my mom, with everything. It's like I'm always disappointing someone. Claire's heart ached for him. She stopped walking and turned to face him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Nathan, listen to me. You're not a disappointment. You're figuring things out. And that's okay. Nobody expects you to have it all together at 18. Heck, I'm 42 and I'm still figuring things out. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. Thanks, Claire, he said softly. I don't know what I'd do without you. You don't have to know, she said with a gentle smile. I'm here no matter what. As they continued their walk, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Nathan shared stories about his favorite video games, and Claire recounted tales from her childhood, including an embarrassing moment when she fell into the river trying to catch a frog. You didn't, Nathan said, laughing so hard he had to stop walking. I absolutely did, Claire said, grinning. I was soaking wet, covered in mud, and my dad just stood there laughing instead of helping me. Nathan shook his head, still chuckling. I wish I could have seen that. You would have laughed too, she said, nudging him playfully. By the time they returned home, the tension that had hung between them seemed to have lifted. Claire felt a sense of relief, though a part of her couldn't help but wonder if the peace would last. That evening after dinner, Claire decided to play some music while cleaning up. She found an old playlist on her phone and hit play, the familiar tunes filling the room. Nathan walked in, pausing in the doorway. This is good, he said, tilting his head as he listened. It's from my glory days, Claire teased, swaying slightly to the beat. Glory days, huh? Nathan smirked. Show me what you've got, Claire laughed, but as the music shifted to a slower song she held out her hand. Come on, let's see if you can keep up. Nathan hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and took her hand. They moved awkwardly at first, laughing as they stumbled over each other's feet, but soon their movements became more fluid, and the laughter gave way to a quiet, tender rhythm. As the song came to an end, they stood still for a moment, their hands still clasped. Claire looked up at Nathan, her breath catching slightly at the intensity in his gaze. Thanks for this, he said softly. I needed it. Me too, Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, after their impromptu dance, the house settled into its usual quiet. Claire finished tidying up the living room, her mind still replaying the moment she and Nathan had shared. It was innocent. She told herself, just a kind gesture to lighten the mood. Yet as she climbed the stairs to her room, she couldn't ignore the warmth that lingered, a strange mix of comfort and unease. She paused at Nathan's door. It was slightly ajar, a soft light spilling into the hallway. Inside, she could hear the faint hum of his music and the occasional rustle of papers. She thought about saying goodnight but decided against it, not wanting to disrupt whatever space he was in. Instead, she retreated to her room and prepared for bed. The next morning brought an air of awkwardness. Nathan joined Claire in the kitchen for breakfast, his movements a little stiffer, his words fewer. Sophie, ever the perceptive observer, perched on the windowsill, her amber eyes darting between the two. Claire tried to keep the mood light. Any big plans for the day, she asked, handing him a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. Not really, Nathan replied, avoiding her gaze as he picked at his food. She sighed inwardly, sensing his discomfort. You know, you can always talk to me, she said gently, about anything. He looked up then, his expression a mixture of hesitation and longing. I know, he said after a moment. It's just complicated. Claire nodded, not wanting to push. Well, whenever you're ready, I'm here. By the time dinner rolled around, Claire decided it was time to address the growing tension. She prepared one of Nathan's favorite meals, spaghetti carbonara, and set the table with an extra effort to make it inviting. When Nathan came down, he seemed surprised by the spread. This looks amazing, he said, a genuine smile breaking through his guarded demeanor. I thought we could use a nice dinner, Claire said with a shrug. Sometimes good food is the best icebreaker. As they ate, the conversation started off slow, but Claire guided it with care, asking about his classes, his friends, and his plans for the future. Nathan responded cautiously at first, but as the meal went on he began to open up, sharing stories and even cracking a few jokes. You're really good at this, you know, he said suddenly, looking at her with an intensity that caught her off guard. At what? She asked, her fork pausing midair. Making people feel seen, like they matter, he said quietly. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. Well, you do matter, Nathan, more than you realize. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. Claire quickly looked away, busying herself with clearing the plates. Later that evening, as Claire curled up on the couch with Sophie, Nathan appeared in the doorway. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice tentative. Of course not, she said, patting the space beside her. He sat down, careful to keep a respectful distance, but Claire could sense the weight of something he wanted to say. Claire, he began, his voice hesitant. I don't know how to explain this, but I've been feeling different lately. About us. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, her mind racing. Nathan, we're family. Whatever you're feeling, we can work through it together. He shook his head, his eyes earnest. It's not that simple. You're not just my aunt. You're more than that to me. Claire felt her breath catch. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. I know it's wrong, Nathan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I know it's complicated, but I can't help how I feel. She closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady but firm. Nathan, I care about you deeply, but we have to be careful. Feelings can be messy, and it's important to understand where they're coming from. He nodded, looking down at his hands. I don't want to make things weird or ruin what we have. I just needed you to know. Claire reached out and placed a hand on his. I appreciate your honesty, Nathan, and I promise we'll figure this out together. The next day, Claire decided to take Nathan out of the house for a change of scenery. They drove to a nearby park with sprawling fields and winding trails. As they walked, their conversation shifted to lighter topics, and Claire noticed Nathan seemed more at ease. Do you remember the time you tried to teach me how to skateboard? She asked, laughing at the memory. Yeah, and you fell flat on your face. Nathan replied with a grin. I thought you'd never forgive me. How could I not? You spent the rest of the day making it up to me, even baking cookies with me, remember? Nathan chuckled. Worst cookies ever, but they did the trick. They shared a laugh, the tension of the previous night seemingly forgotten. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were navigating uncharted waters. That evening after their day at the park, Claire sat alone in the living room, her thoughts a tangled mess. The light from the lamp cast soft shadows on the walls, and Sophie was curled up at her feet, her soft purring the only sound in the house. Claire replayed the events of the past few days in her mind. The accidental encounters, the charged silences, and Nathan's heartfelt confessions. She couldn't ignore the shift in their dynamic, but she also knew she needed to tread carefully. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Come in, she called, already knowing who it would be. Nathan stepped inside, his expression hesitant yet determined. He was holding a small notebook, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of its cover. Isla. I wrote something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought maybe it'd be easier to say what I'm feeling this way. Claire's heart sank and swelled at the same time. She gestured for him to sit, her pulse quickening. Nathan hesitated before sitting down on the edge of the couch, leaving a respectful distance between them. He opened the notebook and began to read, his voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word. It's hard to explain how much you mean to me, he began. You've been my anchor, my guide, and my safe place when everything else felt uncertain. I know it's not fair to put this on you, but I can't pretend anymore. What I feel for you goes beyond admiration. It's something deeper, something I can't ignore. He stopped, looking up at Claire, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. Claire felt a wave of emotions crash over her, compassion, confusion, and an undeniable tenderness. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. Nathan, your words mean a lot to me and I care about you more than I can say. But this is complicated. We have to think about what's right, not just what we feel. I know, he said quickly, and I don't want to make things harder for you, but I had to tell you the truth. You deserve to know. Claire reached out and placed a hand over his, her touch gentle but reassuring. Thank you for trusting me enough to share this, but we need to focus on what we have, our bond, our connection, as something pure and supportive. Let's not let anything cloud that. Nathan nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of disappointment. I just didn't want to keep it bottled up anymore. I'll respect whatever boundaries you set. Claire gave him a small encouraging smile. We'll figure it out together, okay? No matter what. The following days passed in a delicate dance of unspoken feelings and careful interactions. Nathan seemed to take Claire's words to heart, throwing himself into helping around the house and spending more time with his friends. But Claire couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in his behavior. The way he'd steal glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking, or the way his tone softened whenever they spoke. One evening, as they were cooking dinner together, Nathan accidentally brushed her hand while passing her a bowl of vegetables. The touch was fleeting, but the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Claire quickly turned her attention back to the stove, her cheeks flushing. Nathan, she said after a long pause, can we talk about something? He looked up, his expression wary but open. Of course. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. She began, choosing her words carefully. What happened the other night? It's important to me that we keep things honest and respectful. I don't want either of us to feel uncomfortable. Nathan nodded, his gaze steady. I understand. And I promise I'm doing my best to respect that. But I can't promise that my feelings will just disappear overnight. Claire sighed, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. Feelings are tricky, she said gently. But what matters is how we handle them. And I believe we can handle this in a way that keeps us both in a good place. Nathan gave her a small tentative smile. I'll follow your lead, Claire. Always. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying their conversation. She knew Nathan was sincere, but she also knew that their dynamic had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. Sophie hopped onto the bed, curling up beside her and nudging her hand with her head. Claire stroked the cat absent-mindedly, finding comfort in her steady presence. What do I do, Sophie? She whispered. How do I navigate this without hurting him? Or myself? Sophie responded with a soft purr, her eyes half closed but watchful. The next morning, Michelle called to say she'd be returning home in a couple of days. Claire felt a mix of relief and sadness at the news. While Michelle's presence would undoubtedly restore a sense of normalcy, it also meant that the unique bond she'd shared with Nathan during these weeks would change forever. She didn't bring it up to Nathan immediately, unsure of how he would react. Instead, she focused on making their remaining days together as meaningful as possible. One afternoon, they went for a walk along the riverbank. This time, Nathan seemed quieter, lost in thought. Claire finally broke the silence. You okay? She asked gently. Yeah, he said, his voice thoughtful. Just thinking about everything. About how much I've changed while staying here. Claire gave him a curious look. In a good way, I hope. In the best way, he admitted. You've shown me what it means to be heard, to be understood. I don't know if I can ever thank you enough for that. His words warmed her heart, but they also carried a bittersweet note. She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. You've taught me a lot too, Nathan. About resilience, about being open. You've got so much ahead of you, and I know you'll find your path. The final evening before Michelle's return arrived, bringing with it an inevitable sense of closure. After dinner, Nathan knocked on Claire's door, notebook in hand. I wrote something, he said, sitting down across from her. It's not a confession this time. Just a thank you. He opened